thank you everybody for joining. I think this is our first roundtable with our new Director General, Willie Walsh for Media in Africa. I think Willie needs no introduction. I think you know him well. You're all attended Global Media Day. On the line as well, we also have our Regional Vice President for Africa and the Middle East, Kamal Alawadi. So what we'll do is Willie will open with a few opening remarks and then we'll just go to questions. So Willie, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm not going to waste too much time talking to you because I think it's better to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. But obviously, you've probably heard me say it, this is the deepest crisis the industry has ever seen. We're still struggling through, but gladly seeing some positive indications. More and more countries are beginning to relax restrictions. We had the announcement from Canada earlier this week that they'll reopen their borders to the US on the 7th of August and then to other international markets on the 7th of September. They've effectively been closed since the middle of March of last year. In Europe, we're seeing quite a bit of movement now with countries acknowledging the impact of the successful vaccine rollout in most European countries and relaxing restrictions on people who have been fully vaccinated while keeping measures in place to test people who haven't been vaccinated. Asia, a little bit slower. You've seen what's happened in Australia with the closure of some state boundaries and restrictions on international travel, even more than we'd seen before. So, the picture around the world is quite different, but more positive in the second half of this year than in the first half. And, we're optimistic about that improving as we go through the year and clearly looking to a more normal environment in 2022, but still, very challenging for all of our airlines. Africa has been particularly challenging, principally because low levels of vaccine rollout, very little in terms of state support for airlines, and expensive and difficult to get at testing in most African markets. So, as I said, it's not a uniform picture around the world, but there are positive indications in a number of areas, and we remain optimistic that we'll see further improvement as we go through the second half of the year. So maybe on that, Catherine, I'll hand back to you and you can manage the Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So I don't think there's not so many of us in the call, so if you just raise your hand or if you have a question, you want to, please feel free. Guy, yep. You're muted. Guy, you're muted.
Yeah, good. Hi, thank you for your time, Willie. I think my big concern for the recovery of the African aviation industry or airline industry is that COVID would have set back the move towards liberalization. I think it would have set that a long way. I think that we're going to see increasing protectionism. And I think that the history of African government with airlines and just regional cooperation is fairly poor. And that's going to make it extremely difficult for a broad adoption of any set of protocols for the acceptance of, for argument's sake, the IATA travel passport or any standard COVID agreements in terms of testing and so on. So I have to say I'm a little pessimistic about how well the African airline industry is going to recover. Also, you mentioned that there hasn't been much support for the African airline industry from government. Perhaps not, but also I would argue that there has been extremely strong support for their domestic airlines, for the state-owned airlines. There's been a lot of further moves backwards towards protectionism, and without the commitment for matching support for the private sector operators.
Yeah, I'm less concerned about protectionism, Guy, than maybe you are. We're seeing some evidence of that, but not as much as I think people had expected. Clearly, a number of governments have stepped in to financially support their airlines. We've seen that in the case of Air France and Lufthansa, particularly in Europe. But and some of that has come with restrictions and state participation in the airlines. But I expect that to be done on commercial terms. So, you know, in the main, we're not really worried about protectionism. I think it is always a risk. I think you're right in the context of Africa. You know, the progress that has been made may well be disrupted as a result of this, which would be a terrible shame because it's consumers that suffer. You know, I can speak personally for what's happened in Europe, having, you know, worked in the European environment for over 40 years. Liberalization in Europe has made air transport, aviation accessible to everybody in a way that it just wouldn't have been possible without deregulation and liberalization, and it's hugely benefited consumers. And I think the same is absolutely true in the US. Probably less evidence of it there because of the way the industry has consolidated. But even that, I think, proves that, you know, consumers do benefit from continuing strong competition. Africa, without question, would benefit from liberalization. It would accelerate air access across the continent and give people the benefit of, you know, what aviation brings. We've seen that in other parts of the world. I've no doubt we will see it in Africa. But I do agree with you. I think this current crisis has probably delayed actually, you know, the development of that single market in Africa. In relation to the IATA Travel Pass, we developed the IATA Travel Pass principally to help airlines and airports with the process that would be required for departing passengers. Because what we recognize is that, you know, most airports today are not designed to have every customer who's flying go to a check-in desk. You know, personally, it had been about 20 years since I'd gone to a check-in desk. You know, I use online check-in and apps for most of my transactions when I'm dealing with airlines. So, if everybody has to go to a check-in counter to show a document that proves they've taken a PCR test or that they've filled in the relevant forms for entry into the country, you know, the processing time at airports is going to go through the roof. But more importantly, you know, we'll get massive queues because, you know, we'll now have 100% of people going to a check-in desk, where in most European airports, certainly, and in a lot of global airports, that's somewhere between, you know, 50% and 60% of people who still have to, you know, transact at the counter. So that's why we developed the travel app. It was principally for airlines with the departure process. We've since developed it to deal with the arrival process, because what we've seen is, you know, massive queues at immigration as all of these papers get checked again. So, you know, everything is checked before you get on board the airplane, and now everything gets checked again after you get off the airplane. And of course, this is very confusing for customers who think they've already shown evidence of compliance, you know, rooting around for bits of paper when they arrive at the immigration counter. And it's imposing, you know, significant additional workload on immigration officials and causing great queues. So as a result of that, we adapted the IATA Travel Pass to enable people to demonstrate compliance on arrival as well. Now, that is subject to governments accepting it. So what we've seen is we've got over 100 airlines now either trialing or operating the IATA Travel Pass. And we've reached agreement with, I think it's 7 countries, 7 governments who are going to accept it as evidence on arrival. And we're engaged with a further 56 governments who are interested in understanding how it would work to see if they can use it, because they all now recognize that, you know, the bottleneck is going to be on the arrival side of the airport, given that we're there in terms of sorting out the departure side. So, yeah, I'm still optimistic that governments, once they recognize the benefit of having a digital solution, will embrace the IATA Travel Pass and other options that are available. But, you know, it clearly is proving to be a very successful digital solution to the additional measures that have been forced upon airlines since this pandemic started over 15, 16 months ago now.
Just a quick, can you tell us how many African airlines have adopted the trial in the past?
Yeah, so we don't name the airlines that are testing it, but we do have a number of African airlines, who are testing the travel pass at the moment, and we leave it to the airline to pick the timing of their public announcement in relation to whether they're going to use the travel pass or some other form of digital solution. But I can tell you from personal experience, because I have been doing a bit of travel, not as much as I used to. But the IATA travel pass is fantastic versus having to go through all of this processing at a counter, handing over bits of paper. So we do have a number of African airlines using it, trialing it at the moment. The feedback is positive. In fact, the feedback we're having from all of the trialing now is very positive, and you're going to see more widespread use of the IATA travel pass as we go through the second half of the year.
Maybe could you give us the number that are in it, perhaps?
So you were broken up when you asked that question?
I mean, I understand you cannot name the airlines, but could you give us the number of airlines in Africa that are trialing out to the travel pass?
So in terms of the airlines in Africa that have publicly announced, it's Rwandair and Ethiopian Airlines, and we're in negotiations with another 10, which we, as Willie mentioned, we can't comment on yet until they decide they want to publicly announce it. So 2 have publicly announced and in discussions with a further 10. Cool. I think we'll move to a question in the chat now from Michael. What's the likely impact of the seeming resurgence of infections in countries such as the UK on the anticipated recovery?
I don't think it's going to have as much impact as maybe we feared originally, because although we're seeing high levels of virus transmission, it's not translating into high levels of hospitalization or intensive care. And, tragically, there continue to be deaths as a result of the virus, but it's nowhere close to where they were. So the scientific evidence is very clear. The vaccines do help to suppress transmission of the disease, but more importantly, they help to protect people who have been vaccinated. Even, it's still possible that somebody can contract the virus, but it is protecting them against the worst effects of the virus. So what we're seeing in the UK is, a high number of people are getting the virus, but very few are having to go into hospital as a result. And this was, what we expected to see. It's in effect following the normal development of a virus. So our view is quite clear. We're not going to eliminate this virus in the same way as we haven't succeeded in eliminating lots of other viruses. And therefore, we have to learn to live with it. And more countries are acknowledging that. I think, countries that adopted a zero COVID approach are now recognizing that that's effectively impossible. I think there were 1,500 cases of coronavirus in Sydney yesterday, from the latest reports I've seen. Australia had taken the view that they had effectively eliminated the virus in Australia. I think they're now beginning to recognize that that isn't the case. And you're seeing growing frustration amongst Australians that they're now forced into new lockdowns at a time when, virus transmission is still very low relative to other countries. But they're watching the UK, opening up and removing all restrictions at a time where they're locking, down again. So vaccines have clearly had a very positive impact. It's the reason why I think we've got to continue to work with governments to ensure that vaccines are being made available on a global basis, because that's clearly going to be important for everybody. But while not everybody can get access to a vaccine, it's very important that we facilitate those who haven't been able to get vaccinated or can't get vaccinated to be able to travel. And that's why we've said, a sensible testing regime is appropriate to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to travel. So, you know, the situation in the UK is it remains positive. You know, a number of countries have opened their borders to UK citizens, particularly for fully vaccinated. And we're optimistic that that will continue to be the case as we go through the second half of the year.
Thanks, Willie. Heidi, over to you. Have your hand raised. I think you might be muted. Heidi, I think you're muted. Might be easier if you type your question. While we're waiting, any other questions? Edgar, was that your hand raised? No.
Interestingly, you know, we're sitting here at Geneva Airport, which has become much more active. You know, reflecting, I think, what's happening in Europe generally. We're seeing a lot more aircraft movements and a lot more passengers moving through the airport. You know, particularly since the middle of June, where it was very noticeable. And you can see that in the data that Eurocontrol produces, where they're measuring the number of flights being operated. So, you know, a very significant increase in the number of flights being operated around Europe, despite the fact that there's still relatively high levels of daily virus reports in a lot of European countries. I think it does give us confidence and hope around the impact that the vaccination program is having. Okay.
Heidi still having issues, but we'll go over a question from Luke. Luke, you have a question? I think you're also, perfect.
Hi, Willie. It's Luke Daniel here from Business Insider South Africa. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how important it is for governments, and I use South Africa as an example, to digitize and formalize their certificates, vaccines and testing, and how important that is to consolidate with the IATA travel pass. South Africa, just as a bit of context, you know, back in February, there was talk about once people had received their full doses of the vaccine, that they would receive a digital copy of their certificates. And I assume that there was talk about a QR code in a way that would make it harder to forge those documents and more internationally accepted. But that seems to have stalled. How important is it that that process gets restarted and gets re-implemented as quickly as possible? Thank you.
Yeah, I think digital solution is critical, particularly as volumes of passenger movements increase. We did some research at IATA, which predicted that, you know, if we had to continue using manual paper processes, you would get very significant waiting times at airports. So if you looked at the total airport experience from check-in through departure and then the arrival part, you know, we estimated that that would go from about 1.5 hours in a normal peak environment to up to 8 hours if the volume of passengers recovered to the levels we had seen in 2019. Now, obviously, it's not going to be 8 hours because people just won't travel if that is the case. You know, there would be chaos at the airports on departure. So we do need digital solutions. It would be ideal in a global context if we had a common standard that could be applied. That's highly unlikely. You know, we can't even see a common standard being applied within the EU. Where, you know, the Commission has been very active trying to get EU countries to adopt a single standard. I think so far we've seen 10 different versions of the digital COVID certificate that the EU has released. So we have a digital solution, but different standards of the digital solution. Now, I suppose the positive thing in terms of airlines is we're very used to having to deal with different standards. You know, we love it when everybody comes together and we have a single process, but I think that would be wishful thinking at this stage. What we can do with the IATA travel pass is we're working directly with laboratories who are certified for testing, and therefore we can have a direct connectivity with the lab, so you can have trust in the report that you're getting, and that's what it's really all about. You know, governments are trying to understand how can I trust the source of the data. You know, is a piece of paper that can be replicated, is that a trustworthy source of data? And clearly, in some cases that isn't possible. So we're looking to work with as many governments as possible to help provide a digital solution. If they don't have one themselves, we will work with a paper solution, but digital would be ideal for everybody. And I think over time, we will get digital solutions. It may not be a single common approach, but more and more we are seeing people getting into mutual recognition of digital certificates, which the industry is very capable of working with. So hopefully, we will see progress on this front. To be honest, we will have to see it, from a consumer point of view. It's just becoming far too complex understanding what forms you need to fill in, what type of testing you need to do. And that's where IATA has the ability to help, because as you probably know, we have a database called Thematic, which has been used globally for visa and passport requirements and is well known to airports and airlines right across the world, and indeed many governments as well. And we're now using that to provide a secure and reliable data source to understand what health requirements are needed for customers traveling between various countries, and in many cases through transit countries to get to their final destination. So we have the database available, and we're building on that database to enable the IATA Travel Pass to work. And it's available there as a reliable source and trusted source of data that people can leverage off. And that's why we're developing the IATA Travel Pass for our members, and more laterally, recently, to make it available to governments as well.
Thanks, Willie. So, well, throughout last year, we've been really vocal, calling for the 30 billion that was pledged for air transport and tourism in Africa, and some of that obviously due to go to airlines to be unblocked and for it to filter through to those that needed it. Are you able to provide an update on that? And where is the issue standing at the moment? And then maybe you could touch briefly on blocked funds in the country, which is obviously a separate matter, but still majorly affecting airlines in the region.
Yeah, it's disappointing when you see money's being set aside and being promised and earmarked to help. It is frustrating when that's not flowing through to the people that need it, to assist them through this extremely difficult period. So, we have, as an organization, been vocal, urging governments in particular to recognize the extreme nature of this crisis. It is, by any measure, different to anything we've witnessed before, and to recognize and appreciate the critical importance of the infrastructure being in place to support economic recovery when we get through this crisis. Because, without the network of connectivity that air transport gives, global economic conditions will be more challenging, and it's particularly the case for Africa. I think one of the positives we've seen in Africa is the growth in air cargo, which has clearly been very positive and has helped to provide very needed cash to a number of airlines. But it demonstrates just how important air connectivity is to economic development and economic security to Africa, because it provides access to markets that otherwise wouldn't be available. So it's very important that governments understand that the global connectivity that airlines have provided in Africa is not going to be secure unless the airlines that provide it are financially secure. And in many cases, they will need support, as airlines right across the world have needed. And to put it into context, people often ask me, I managed an airline through 9/11 and through the global financial crisis and through the beginning of this. If you want a metric, and revenue is probably an easy one to remember. In 2001, following the tragic events of 9/11, the airline industry's revenues fell by 6.4%. That was a major impact on the industry. In 2009, revenues fell by 16.5% versus 2008. So massive crisis, much greater than what we'd seen in 2001. But in 2020, revenues in the industry fell by almost 56% against 2019. Completely different scale. So airlines do need financial support, particularly if governments want to ensure that key connectivity remains in place when the recovery starts. In relation to block funds, this is very important because, if airlines can't repatriate funds.
Sorry, Willie, 1 minute. Sorry, it's a really bad line. Could I ask the people that have just joined maybe to mute themselves, if that's okay, if they're not speaking? Thanks. Sorry, Willie.
Yeah, so it does make a big difference to airlines and does influence decision-making in relation to capacity and network development if funds can't be repatriated. So the industry has significant trapped funds in a number of countries in Africa. This always plays, I can speak from personal experience, when this happens, airline management teams immediately look at their schedules, their capacity. It's very much a risk analysis then. Do I continue to provide services when I know I can't recover the money? In effect, you're providing services, free of charge because you have the cost, but you're not getting the revenues associated with it. Or do I cut back on the amount of capacity that I have in those markets? And 99% of times, trapped funds lead to reduced capacity and reduced schedules and reduced access. So it's a very important issue for the industry. It does have a major influence on airline management teams when they're looking at the markets that they serve and how they serve those markets. And therefore, it's important that governments appreciate that, it does have a significant effect when funds get trapped.
Thanks, Heidi, for that question. And thanks, Willie. Any other questions from anybody that's just joined before we wrap up? Another question from Michael. What is the aggregated, the total value of block funds in Africa, and how does it compare elsewhere?
Yeah, it's particularly high in Africa. From memory, and Catherine can correct me, I think it's about 650 million altogether, but I'm not exactly sure of the final figure. It's very much the case that Africa as a continent is probably the one that has most block funds. There are other countries around the world where we have funds blocked. What we often see is it's a temporary blockage in terms of getting the funds repatriated. In Africa, there have been a number of countries that have where we've seen funds persistently blocked. And as I said, that does affect the decisions of airlines to serve those markets. So it is important that the government appreciates the impact, the direct impact that can have on connectivity to their country, and the economic loss that's associated with that, not just for the consumers who have fewer choice, but on the global connectivity, inward investment. People need to be able to get access to markets, and if the air transport links are removed, we know there's always a direct impact on economic prosperity and economic growth.
Yeah, and just to confirm what Willie said, it's 601 million in blocked funds across 17 countries, and Africa is the region with the highest amount of blocked funds. We'll move to another question from Heidi. Does Willie have any pointers on what needs to happen in a general sense, or rather, when will we see a return to normal for Africa? So
Yeah,
what does the recovery trajectory look like?
Yeah, I think the recovery clearly will be dependent on the vaccine rollout, which has been slow in Africa for understandable reasons. I think it is important that governments listen to the WHO, who've been very clear in terms of the need for a global solution to the pandemic, and therefore the need for richer countries to make vaccines available on significant scale to ensure that everybody globally can get access to a vaccine. So I'm hopeful that we'll see the rollout of vaccines in Africa accelerate as we go through 2021, but more importantly into 2022. It's not right that rich countries are stockpiling vaccines when there are countries who can't get access to the vaccine. And given the success that we've seen in a number of countries who clearly have significant availability of vaccines, I think it would be good to see more vaccines being made available to countries, not just in Africa, but countries globally who can't get the same access. So it's very important, not just for the industry, but for everybody, for global economic development, that we see widespread availability of vaccines, and I would expect to see that. But it's globally, I think we're at about 27% of people who have been vaccinated. Some countries are in the 70% range. Africa is in low single digits at the moment. So we think that we'll see that improve as we go through the year. But vaccines are definitely a key to a more normal environment. In the absence of vaccines, as I said, sensible and fair testing, where testing is used. So we can't, tolerate the situation where prices are high for what is a relatively cheap form of testing. We're very keen that governments understand the value of rapid antigen testing versus the more expensive and time-consuming PCR testing, because we think the quality of testing from rapid antigen can be just as effective when it comes to risk management. So there are a number of measures that can be taken, but the situation is improving, and I think we've got to be optimistic, as I said, that we will continue to see that improve as we go through this year and into next year.
Thanks, Willie. Guy, you have another question?
Thanks, Justin. We've already got red lists and what have you, and there are a number of African countries that have been quite slow, or dare I say delinquent, in actually addressing the COVID problems in their country and developing the necessary databases and so on. Do we think that there's a possibility that we'll return to the bad old days of the famous blacklist, or the infamous blacklist, where some countries will simply be prevented from sending passengers to, say, Europe, unless they can get their COVID house in order?
No, I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because I think there's more general acceptance in Europe that we have to live with this virus. And, as most European countries have high levels of vaccination for their citizens or residents, I think they're more confident of the protection that they're getting as a result of that. So I think there will be some measures in place, where some additional testing will be required for people traveling from some countries, but I would not expect to see a return to blacklisted countries. I think that would be grossly unfair, because it's clear that this is a global pandemic and therefore requires a global solution. It's not a virus that's particular to one part of the world. It is everywhere. It's endemic now in many countries. So I don't expect that to happen. And what we've been pushing for is for sensible measures to be put in place based on data rather than anecdote. And quite honestly, the data that's available to us at the moment suggests that governments could be much more relaxed about the restrictions that they have in place. What we've argued is, you can understand a government putting restrictions in place in 2020 when this virus first became evident. We didn't know what we were dealing with. We were in effect dealing with an unknown, but something that was clearly highly transmissible and did have major health implications. The fear, as you will recall, was that health systems would be overrun with people requiring medical attention. those fears are largely abated now in most countries, and therefore there's a strong argument to be made for a relaxation, or in some cases removal of the restrictions that were put in place in 2020 when you're dealing with an unknown event. The risk environment today is very different and much lower than the risk environment we were operating in. And we have a responsibility to keep reminding governments of that and to encourage them to be more pragmatic about the measures that they're taking. Because it's very clear that people can safely travel. You know, the risk of actually catching the virus on board an airplane is very, very low. There's good scientific evidence to support that. And with reasonable testing regimes in place, it is absolutely safe for people to continue to travel internationally. So we would be, continuing to argue for restrictions removed for people who are vaccinated and sensible, cheap, accessible testing where people haven't been able to access vaccination.
Great. Thanks very much, Willie.
Thanks, Willie. I don't see any other hands, so I think, Guy, I think that's from before. So thank you everybody for joining. We'll circulate the recording, and if you have any more questions, then please don't hesitate to send us an email and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Look forward to
Thank
seeing
you.
you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.